want to take you on a journey of how Ireland changed the world. Our journey begins in 400 AD. Rome has conquered most of the then known world, but the Roman Empire is left alone, a small country, an island off the west coast of Europe, furthest west. That is Ireland. The Irish were wild. They were known as a terrifying people who were fierce and most feared throughout the world, where their myth and their legend went before them. And the Irish, they were skilled seafarers, and they spent their days, many of them, going to the neighboring country of Britain, and they would send out fleets who would go and they would raid all of the wealthy landowners and farms, and they would go in and they would steal their children and would bring them back as slaves to auction off in the slave market. And what they would do is they would go in at the dead of night and they would steal, and they'd be halfway back to Ireland before anyone else knew. We read of one young 16-year-old boy. His name was Patricius. Most of us know him as Patrick. And Patrick, he was a Christian, Romanized Briton, living in quite a middle-class family, a family where his father was a Roman tax collector. His grandfather was a priest, and he writes in his autobiography, Confession, he writes of how he had grown up in that household and he didn't really have any interest in God. He didn't really, read the Bible and believe the Christian values until that one night in which the Irish had come in to his home and had captured him and brought him back to the coast of Ireland, just like where we are today in Downpatrick. Here we stand in one of the oldest monastic sites, Nendrum, the oldest monastic site in Ireland. And Patrick writes about how he would be alone for months on end as he was sold as a slave, as a shepherd slave in Antrim. And as he was alone, hungry, starving, on his own with sheep, he cried out to God. He became desperate for God, and over the 6 years in which he was a slave, in his formative years, he became a man after God's own heart. He grew strong in the Lord, and he became a visionary. The Lord began to speak to him, and he began to speak to him in dreams until one night, 6 years into being a slave, he spoke to Patrick and he showed him a picture of the ship in which would take him home. And so Patrick wakes up one morning and he starts walking, and many believe he walked from Antrim to the coast of Wexford, 200 miles, where he boards a ship and he goes off and he sets off and he arrives in the continent of Europe. And that's where our journey continues. As Patrick, he writes about the shock as he walks through the devastating ruins of what once was this great empire, Rome, and the Roman Empire that right throughout Europe now lies in ruins. Rome, founded in 8th century BC, became the superpower of the world. It had taken over most of Europe, North Africa, and much of the Middle East. And we see, as we read the Gospels, that Jesus was born into this world. He was born under Roman oppression and Roman rule. And as we see that Jesus' his life, death, and resurrection, he commissions his disciples to go into all the world to preach the gospel. And what's really interesting about church history is that the first church, it goes through this period where they are persecuted, they are tortured, they are murdered for preaching the gospel, but then Christianity becomes adopted as the Roman religion. And it's forced, the whole Roman Empire is forced to adopt Christianity. And here we see something very interesting. We see the birth of the Roman Catholic Church. And they begin by starting with the first pope of many believe is the Apostle Peter, the one in which was Jesus' disciple, where he said, "Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail." So the gospel began to spread out throughout the world. And we see that it becomes the main Roman religion. But it becomes just that. It became a religion. And the time that Patrick, he was taken as a slave and then set free and enters into the continent of Europe, we see over a period of years that Rome had begun to disintegrate from the inside out. We see that paganism and atheism, it becomes running rampant as people become obsessed with being pleasured and being entertained and giving in to indulgences. And what we see happens over time is this great Roman Empire becomes a nation that is falling apart from the inside. We see in the time it's 410 AD. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, and his Gothic tribe and his army turn up at the gates of Rome. The first time in 11 centuries that this eternal city of Rome, and he enters through the gates, and we're in a city that once would have been faced with fierce opposition, when faced with one of the greatest armies, the Roman army that had ever lived. He walks in without any opposition. And the Gothics and the barbarians, they have but one purpose, and that is to destroy Rome. It is to take apart the social and historical structure and bring Rome to its destruction. And over 60 years, what happens is they go from Rome right throughout the Roman Empire, and they begin burning all of the libraries, all of the books. They begin burning any thought of philosophy, of psychology, of biology, and of science, and they bring the world to its knees. And it goes from this once great empire to a pagan, barbaric, atheist society. So over the next 100 years, from the sacking of Rome in 410 AD, we see that civilization itself, with Christianity at the core, it begins to fall apart. People forget what it meant and what it means to think, or how to read, and how to build these magnificent architecture and buildings. And we see that civilization itself becomes barbaric. Now, what's really interesting, and why I'm saying all this, is when you look back at history and the fall of the Roman Empire, we can see some characteristics and some things that can transfer over to our own Western Empire, our own Western civilization. As we've gone from many of our culture and our society that was based in Christian values and principles has become more atheistic. In some ways, it's become more barbaric. We've seen that where you are now challenged not to think for yourself, but instead to follow the status quo. We can see that there's a tearing down of the historical and philosophical values that our society and our structure was built upon. We see that even biology and science has been brought into disrepute, where it's not to offend the narrative, and in particular, it's not to defend a very select part, a minority of society. We've seen our schools and our education system that was at one stage built on values and familial values and built on principles that were rooted in Christianity, now has become more filled with woke politics and leftist ideology, and where it's about fulfilling this certain role and not to offend, but instead to defend a sexuality and a gender ideology that we do not agree with. Not only that, but we see our governments that once, in Ireland in particular, that had risen up to fight for the people, now is led by a very select few elite that has no interest in the people. We see that leadership has fallen apart, not just in our life and culture, but in our home, where the male has been feminized, where the heads of the family has been cut off. And what we see happening is we see our society disintegrating from the inside out, just like it did in the Roman Empire. Just like it did going from Christianity to paganism, headed towards atheism and barbaric. We can see our own society becoming no moral fabric, no direction, no Christian values and principles. And what excites me when I look back at history, what gets me so passionate and enthusiastic, is at this time when Rome was falling apart, when the world was in disarray and it was entering into a dark age, one of the darkest ages that our world has ever seen, God shifts his attention to one small island off the side of the continent. That island was known as Era. Era is defined as the most fertile and abundant land. He chooses the Irish to be light in the darkness, to bring hope to the world. And I just wonder, maybe God might do it again. Maybe as we see that history might be feeling like it's repeating itself, well, can we turn to God and we can say, hey, we're ready to rise up and once again place Jesus at the center of our lives of our culture and see the church rise up in Ireland again. So Patrick finally returns home and his family embrace him and they ask him, never leave ever again. But one night in a dream, a familiar man he knew approaches Patrick with a letter, and it's titled, "The Voice of the Irish." And as he reads it in his dream, he hears crowds cry out saying, "We beg you to come and walk among us once more." Night after night, the visions increase until Christ himself speaks directly to Patrick. Just as he spoke to the Apostle Paul, he says to Patrick, "He who gave his life for you, he it is who speaks within you." And in this, he gets confirmation from Jesus, and Patrick makes the decision that he will become a priest and prepare himself to return to the Irish, to bring the gospel to all four corners of the land. I love that. The voice of the Irish cried out. That's what Christ was speaking within him and directing him to a people who were in need of hearing the gospel. Today, the voice of the Irish cries out, not to hear a gospel of religion and legalism, but to hear a gospel of grace, to hear a hope for themselves and a hope for the future. Not only do I believe that we need to respond to the voice of the Irish bringing the gospel, but I believe that we need to be a voice to Ireland and to the world. That we will see a new church rise up. Not the church of old, the church of abuse, the church of legalism, the church of breaking the backs of the people who are to serve the church and God, but a church that's there to serve the people, to follow Jesus and point them towards Jesus. And what we see happen in this time when Roman Empire is falling apart and disintegrating, when the whole world is entering into darkness, we see a spiritual light become alive. And that light is in Ireland. We see a people, the Irish, become rising up to not be the ones of warriors of old, but now to be warriors of the gospel. And what we see happen is St. Patrick begins to enter back into Ireland. And as he spreads the gospel, as he preaches the gospel, we see the new Irish church rise up and change the world. So Patrick, hearing and responding to the voice of the Irish, he travels to Europe to a monastery where he studies to be ordained. And over a 25-year period, he becomes a priest and then a bishop until the day comes where he travels back to Ireland and he became the very first bishop missionary in the history of Ireland. So when he arrives at the shores of Downpatrick, he came here to this very site. Here we are at Saul Church in Downpatrick. And it was his very first convert, a landowner, that gave Patrick his barn where Patrick was able to start the very first church, the very first public place of worship. It became the base of operations to reach Ireland with the gospel, and the very first place that we would see Patrick bring the gospel right throughout the four corners of Ireland. Just as Paul brought the gospel to the Gentile world, Patrick was the very first to bring the gospel outside of the Roman Empire to what was known as a barbarian nation. And in the time that the Roman Empire was going from peace to chaos, Ireland was rising from chaos to peace. And over the 30-year span that St. Patrick was here at this place, at Saul, and right throughout Ireland, we see it became from what was a pagan, atheistic nation to a Christian nation. To contrast that with today, we've become the fastest secularized nation in the world. Being obsessed with leftist ideology, become a nation that's anti-God, anti-church. But yet when you go deep beyond the surface, when you get to the root of the Irish people, it's still in our DNA. It's still in our heritage, the Christian heritage. And I wonder, could God do it again? Where we could see Ireland going from that place of chaos, the place of paganism and atheism, to a Christian nation, to see the light burn again brightly in our land, that we would see our land and this light not just stay here in this land, but go and spread right throughout Europe and right throughout the world. So the question is it possible to change the spiritual trajectory of a nation? Just as Patrick, he transformed the Irish people, I believe that it is possible that we could see the Irish people once again transformed through the gospel. And what we see after Patrick, what happens is the Irish people go from an illiterate society to a hunger and a desire for reading and for books and for the Bible. And one of the most famous and iconic people after Patrick was a man named Columba. Many believe that he took up the mantle of St. Patrick, and he founded within his days 100 monasteries, two of which are two of the most famous, the monastery of Kells and the monastery of Iona. And what was happening, that the Gothics and the barbarians, they were ripping through Rome. They were Rome and the Roman Empire and Europe, and they were burning the libraries, burning the books, burning any thought of history and philosophy and psychology and biology and science. And they were wanting to destroy the very fabric of society and burn down the social structure. But what we see happening is that monks and scholars and priests, they were hearing about what was going on in Ireland. And they traveled to Ireland as a place of refuge. They traveled to the different monasteries, not just along the coast of Ireland, but places like Iona and the coast of Scotland. And what we see happening is this revolution was rising up in Ireland. It was a place that was known as the light of the world, in places not just like Saul and like Nendrum, and as what we'll see soon in Bangor Abbey. But what happened is that we see the light of the world was not just preserved and conserved, but what I see is the next interesting part of history, where the light was brought to the rest of the world. So here we are at Bangor Abbey, one of the oldest abbeys in Ireland. And in fact, on this site, there has been a place of Christian worship for 1,500 years. Bangor Abbey was known as the light of the world because it had copied so many manuscripts of the books that had been destroyed right throughout the Roman Empire and Europe. One of the most important things that they did at Bangor Abbey was that they trained and raised up missionaries. And they sent missionaries out into the then known world. And what they would do is they'd get the books and they strap the books around their waist. They jump into the boat, set off from the shores and set across to Europe and Africa and right throughout the world, bringing the gospel, bringing light in the midst of one of the most darkest ages that our world has ever seen before. Bangor Abbey was also known as a place of worship and of prayer. There was 24-hour prayer for 250 years. 250 years of unending prayer and worship. And many, they attain and attribute all of the missionary revival that's literally saved the world. It brought the gospel back to light in a place of utmost darkness. It was because of the men and women and their faithfulness to prayer and devotion and worship. And it is powerful. Can you imagine that the prayers that we pray, the seeds that we sow, the sacrifice that we make today may make an impact tomorrow, that we may see revival once again break out in our land and throughout, and see God do a new thing through Ireland. The most famous missionary, the pioneer, the one who followed in the footsteps of St. Patrick himself was Columbanus. St. Columbanus, born in 540 AD in Leinster. And even though he predated Martin Luther, the pioneer of the Reformation in the 1500s, by 1,000 years, he was the first to bring about private confession that was adopted into Christianity. He was one of the first to preach about the gospel of grace and the never-ending grace of Jesus that we can receive for the forgiveness of our sins. And he had a passion, not to just conserve and preserve the gospel, but bring the gospel to Europe. And his passion was to see people of all ages, all sins come to know Jesus. So Columbanus, he spent 25 years here at Bangor Abbey, 25 years training and preparing himself until he became the first missionary to Europe. He first traveled to Gaul, or France as we know it. And there at Brittany, he established 3 monastic sites, one after the other, and he created a base of operations. And from that base of operations, he founded 100 monasteries in places like France and Germany and Switzerland and Italy, the place where Rome was. And he brought the gospel back to Europe. We read of Thomas Cahill, who wrote the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. He believes, and I believe, that it's because of Columbanus that the Irish were known as a people who brought the gospel to the world. He writes these words. He says, in the bays and the valleys of the exile, the Irish re-established literacy. They breathed new life into the exhausted literacy culture of Europe. And that is how the Irish saved civilization. That's how Ireland changed the world. So what does this mean for us, Open Arms? Well, we've been to places like Nendrum Monastic Site, one of the oldest sites in Ireland. We've been to Saul Church, St. Patrick's very first church, and here, Bangor Abbey, the oldest place of Christian worship. All of these were a base of operations to first bring the gospel to Ireland and then throughout the world. Imagine that God could do it again. He chose the Irish to be light in the darkness. It's in our DNA, it's in our blood, it's in our heritage, it's in our land that God can use us, the Irish and the Irish people, whether you're drawn here or whether you're born here, that we can again see Ireland be a place of light, light in the world to all around us. So as we look forward for our vision, as we look at refreshing and redeveloping our building in Newbridge of Kildare, as we look at purchasing and developing a base of operations in South Dublin, imagine what is possible. Imagine what God can do through us. Imagine if we would choose to invest and to sow and to sacrifice today so that we can make a difference tomorrow. I believe that God is doing it again. I believe that God is calling us. I believe that this is the time, and I'm asking you, Open Arms, to be a part of this. Imagine what we can do together.